Hello everyone, this is Professor Casey. Welcome back. Today we're discussing chapter 25 from David Emory Shi's America: A Narrative History, and this deals with the infamous Great Depression. Okay, this is the cliff that we've been building up to that we're about to go over. Right? We've been building up to this in the last couple of chapters, discussing the 1920s, all of the social drama that's been going on in the country. But the economic reality of everything is really what ends up dictating America's future for the next few years. Okay? And this is an unprecedented time in American history because the government starts to step in and do brand new things that it's never done before. And most of it is done out of sheer necessity because there is no other viable alternative in terms of in terms of policy, in terms of economics, in terms of laws, government agencies, you name it. Right? So this is a whole brand new thing, and it's the largest economic crisis that America faces in the early 20th century. Sets a large precedent for the next several decades, in fact. We don't really see anything like this again until we really get into the first few years of the 21st century. Okay, so this is a brand new thing that America has never seen before. So we'll kind of get into how it starts, how we're able to get through it, and what ultimately ends it. So in the 1920s, as we've talked about in the last couple of chapters, America has finally shifted its industrial sector over to one that produces consumer products instead. Okay? So we're no longer just producing railroads and oil and steel and all that kind of stuff. Now we're taking all of that technology and all those materials and we're forming brand new things that we can sell to the public. Okay? So everything like we talked about in the last couple of chapters, right? Automobiles, we have the airline industry. We have, flush toilets, refrigerators, vacuum cleaners, wristwatches, you name it. And with all these brand new products that are being made available to the American public, a lot of people are starting to realize that this stuff is not going away anytime soon. In fact, it's gaining in popularity instead. And so people turn around and they begin to invest in the stock market, right? And the stock market is what controls the shares of all these different companies that are making these consumer products. Okay, so it draws a lot of people in because they realize that this is a potential way for them to make a lot of money. And to give you a sense of perspective here, between 1919 and 1929, right, just in the 10-year period from the end of the First World War until the stock market actually crashes, the number of stock purchases in the United States absolutely skyrockets. Okay, we go from 317 million in 1919, which is a lot, even for the time period, to over a billion before the stock market crashes. Okay, and the population of the United States at this point is extremely small compared to what it is today. Today, we're hovering somewhere around 300 million people, but at this point in time, we're sitting around maybe half that, right? Maybe about 150 to 180 million people, give or take, okay, in the United States, right? The numbers are not really definitive, and it's kind of hard to determine it from the census data from the time. Okay? But this is still a lot of people who are investing in this. And to make matters worse, to kind of exacerbate things, at the end of World War I, now that we no longer have the need to have high taxes in the country to pay for the war, we end up with a lot of tax cuts for Americans. Okay, we slash taxes to basically cut off the war period, and so a lot of people have a lot of extra money now that they would have had to pay in taxes before. Then they turn around and they take that money and they invest it in the stock market again. Okay, so we see a pattern here beginning to develop already. Okay, people are really interested in making money off of all these new consumer products. And the way this works is a little bit complicated, but I'll try to simplify it as much as I can. It's called borrowing on margin. Okay, and what the way this works is something similar to any kind of major investment you would make today, right? If you're buying a car, for instance, okay, you typically make some kind of a down payment. You don't always have to do that today, but at this point in time, you would have to make a small cash down payment, which is called a margin. Okay, and you would put this cash payment on a share of some kind, whatever it happens to be. If it's a share in Ford Motor Company or whatever it happens to be. Okay? And then you would borrow the rest of the money that you would need in order to pay off that share from a stockbroker. Okay? Now, the stockbroker holds on to the stock certificates themselves in case the price ends up dropping. Okay? So I'll kind of explain now how this ends up working. Okay? If the stock prices end up going up, Okay, if it gets to be too much, right, then the investor can pay off the loan to the broker, and then they can take the money that they have, whatever money that they've made off the stock itself, and then they can reinvest it. Ideally, this is what is supposed to happen. This is what people want to happen. Okay, if the stock price goes up, people are able to make money off of this stock, and then they turn around and they sell it for more than what they purchased it for. Okay, so again, this is just like buying. Most people think of this in the way that the housing market goes today, right? You want to buy a house, potentially fix it up a little bit, make it nice, and if you decide to resell it later, you ideally want to sell it for more than what you paid for it, right? You want to be able to get a little bit of something out of it, and that's what people want from the stock market. The bad side of this is if the stock price drops, okay, and the buyer is not able to meet the margin call, in other words, if they're not able to pay it off, then the brokers can take that stock and sell it. Okay? In which case, whoever it is that has invested in this stock, if they're unable to repay, then they essentially default on the loan. And if this happens enough time, obviously it can ruin a person's credit, and if they don't have any money, it can lead to bankruptcy. Okay? So this is of course not what people want to happen, but ultimately this is what happens to a lot of people in the United States. This is the nightmare scenario for the Great Depression, and unfortunately this is the harsh reality. Because from September to October of 1929, as the stock market is getting overinflated with people actually investing in it, and now that suddenly the nations of Europe are unable to repay their war loans, all of a sudden the stock market enters into a free fall. Okay, because now people suddenly realize there is no money anymore. And the major precipitating event of all this happens on October 29th of 1929, and it's called Black Tuesday. And Black Tuesday is the quintessential, again, it's the nightmare scenario for the stock market. This is what sets the precedent for the image of the stock market crashing anytime in the future, right? Stock prices enter into a complete free fall, and now all of the stockbrokers who have all of these banknotes, they no longer are able to turn around and sell these stocks to anybody else. Okay, and ideally they are able to stay in business and keep doing what they're doing because they can turn around and resell the stock. But now that there's nobody around to buy it, now that the stuff is essentially worthless because no one from Europe has any money anymore, now all of a sudden there's no money to go around and there's nothing that can be done. And in one single day, in October of 1929, investors end up losing $15 billion collectively in stock prices. Okay? And by the end of the month, which is only 2 more days, it's $50 billion. And these numbers are so dramatic. Any film that you see about the Great Depression, there are a lot of instances where you see stockbrokers committing suicide. And this was unfortunately a reality. Many people realized that they were losing several millions of dollars in whatever stock that they had in their own possession, right? Whatever stockbrokers actually had several different contracts working. If they lost it all, suddenly they have absolutely nothing to rely on, and the impact of it was so great. Many of them were jumping out of windows of buildings, shooting themselves, all kinds of horrible things. But this was something that people realized that they couldn't recover from immediately. And the high stress of the stock market in general, again, is still kind of the stereotypical thing associated with it. And this is part of the reason for that. Right? We start to see so many people, and potentially the backlash of this, if these people hadn't committed suicide, is quite frankly, a lot of them just would have lost their jobs, they would have lost credibility, lots of different things. And it's not just not just the stockbrokers themselves, the investors also are impacted by this, more so in the long term, because they're the ones who end up going into bankruptcy, they're the ones who end up having to foreclose on their houses, on farms, on all kinds of things. So this is the biggest disaster America should have expected to happen and didn't. By 1930, we have over 26,000 businesses in the United States completely shutting their doors. Okay? They're not able to pay whatever loans they have. They're not able to pay their employees. They've lost all their stocks. All these things are suddenly disappearing off the face of the earth. And by 1932, as a direct result of this, because no one is investing in the stock market anymore because the stocks themselves are worthless, and because so many people are taking their money out of the bank. Over 9,000 banks in the United States end up closing. And this doesn't sound like a whole lot in today's terms, but these banks are, this is really before any kind of major um, uh, localized bank franchises really existed. I mean, certain ones like Wells Fargo and so forth would have existed at this time, but these are banking companies themselves that are closing, not just individual localized banks, right? And even still, localized banks themselves, there weren't that many of them in the country. Okay? So comparatively speaking, this would be somewhere in the equivalent of 90,000 banks closing today. So whole lot of people are suddenly um, just completely out of everything. And the factors that go into it, there's three major factors that are really pointed to in terms of why this ends up happening. One of them is the combination of overproduction of items and underconsumption of items. And this seems kind of counterintuitive compared to what we talked about in the last couple of chapters, that it seems like Americans are buying a lot of things, and that is true to a certain extent, right? The floor of living does rise in the United States during the 1920s, in part because of all the economic prosperity that the country has. But not everybody in the country is able to access these things. Okay, places like the South, for instance, are still lagging far behind the rest of the country. Many of them don't even have running water or electricity at this point. So not everybody's able to enjoy these types of things on an equal level. And the other thing too is business owners are not really investing so much in their employees anymore, right? They're not really giving employees raises or anything like that anytime these tax cuts and so forth come around. Instead, they're investing back in the company itself, right? They're buying perhaps new machinery or new facilities or something, but they're not really helping the people themselves. Okay, so poor investments tend to make up a large portion of this. And also to give you a sense of perspective here, in 1929, two-thirds of families in the United States earn less than $2,000 on an annual basis. Okay, and that's a family salary. Okay, again, in today's terms, if a family earns, I think it's somewhere around $60,000 or less, then they're hovering around the poverty line. And again, with inflation and everything, this is roughly around what this would be what the typical American family would be making back then, is somewhere around $60,000, give or take. Okay, so to give you that sense of perspective, there's not a whole lot of economic prosperity in terms of everybody having that. Right. In broad strokes, yes, the economy of the United States has increased a little bit, but not everybody's on a level playing field here. And again, the factory production has gone down quite a bit as well. Okay, because we've switched over from factory production to consumer products, right? The United States gross domestic product, or GDP, drops about 27% from the time the stock market crashes until 1933. Okay, and it's because so many of these factories have been converted over to consumer products, but because people in the U.S. don't have a whole lot of money, or any in many cases during the Great Depression, there's not really a need for them to have any of these consumer product factories. And the other thing about this too is that farmers are still probably at the bottom of the totem pole in the country in terms of economic prosperity. They also are taking out loans in many different instances, some to purchase land, some to purchase farming products, all kinds of different factors involved here as well. Okay, but again, they're the ones who tend to be the hardest hit, and they're the ones that you start to see migrating westward, especially as we get further into the Depression. But we'll get there here shortly. The other thing about this too is that in 1929 there is strangely a surplus harvest that actually occurs. Okay, people in the U.S. are doing pretty well in terms of the actual the tools that they're using, the seed that they have. There's a combination there that actually leads to a large amount of produce that's actually created or grown and sown and all this kind of stuff and harvested in 1929. And as a direct result, because there's so much of it at market, people have to actually sell it for a lower price. So while this does help the consumer, for farmers, it's not exactly good news, because when they try to sell something, they're forced to sell it for less. Okay? And so they don't make as much money, and as a direct result, they're not able to make as big of a payment on their debt. Remember, farmers tend to be the ones who want inflation to occur, and this is kind of a situation of deflation. The other thing, the other major factor, factor two, if you like, is that the government has a lot of policy failures that occurred during this time. Okay? For one thing, in 1930, there is something, and if you're a fan of Ferris Bueller's Day Off, you'll recognize this one. It's called the Smoot-Hawley Tariff Act of 1930. And this is something that is supposed to, on the surface, help farmers, but it actually ends up hurting them more. It's supposed to raise all tariffs in the United States on any kind of farming product and any kind of import coming from overseas. Okay, so anything that is supposed to be shipped into the United States has to pay a penalty. If you're trying to buy it or if you're trying to sell it from overseas, you have to pay a penalty for it. Okay, and this is really supposed to basically do exactly what the Republican Party and American commerce has been doing since the 19th century. Right, trying to keep this sense of isolation in place, trying to keep everything being produced in-house, and to get rid of all foreign competition. Ideally, it's supposed to help farmers, but instead, what it ends up doing is causing farmers to have to pay more for the products and the stuff that they want and need. Okay, so not everything that farmers want and need is being produced in the United States, is what it amounts to. And the other problem, too, on the other end of all this, is that, remember, Europe is still having a lot of trouble repaying any of its loans. Okay? And so when it comes to France and Great Britain in particular, they can't repay their war debts to the United States very well because the United States is taxing them for all the products that they're trying to sell. Okay? So they don't really have a decent way of making money. So we're basically cutting them off at the knees here. And many other countries end up retaliating with tariffs of their own. So when the United States tries to get into a global market at some point, they're not allowed to make a whole lot of money either. Okay? So this ends up kind of, it becomes a self-defeating principle here. Okay? The United States is not able to maintain decent relations with the rest of the world, and kind of causes people to end up resenting the United States quite a bit. And of course, the other part of this too, in terms of what the government does, is the Federal Reserve Board, rather than actually increasing the money supply, which is what it typically should do anytime a government goes into economic crisis like this, is they end up doing the exact opposite. They've done this a couple of other times already in the last few decades before this. They end up reducing the money supply in the country because they're worried that inflation is going to cause the stock market to get worse. Okay, and strangely enough, it actually makes the economy of the United States worse, okay, because people are not able to repay their loans. And as a direct result, we end up with over 10,000 bank closures and innumerable bankruptcies from 1929 to 1932. I mean, the sheer number of people who lose everything they have is incalculable. There's no way to go back and actually keep a correct tally of it. People lose their homes, they lose farms, and again, many of them end up, falling into desperation. They, people get into selling their homes, their products, their children in some cases. We'll talk about that here in a few minutes too. But this is only the beginning. I mean, we're still only in the first year or two of all this. And of course, the third major factor, which we've already touched on a little bit here, is the fact that Europe is absolutely in a state of total chaos. Okay, there's no real unifying principle in Europe at this point, right? Except that there's chaos. There's a complete inability to repay any kind of war debts to the United States because of all the tariffs that the U.S. is being put in place. And because many of the agricultural sector in Europe is destroyed because of the landscape being bombarded during the First World War. Many of the countries that are brand new countries are just now starting to get on their feet, just now starting to create currency and government systems of their own. And the ones that already do exist are having to kind of pick up the pieces from the end of the war. And so the $11 billion in total that's loaned to the Allied forces by the United States, and we loan them another $5 billion on top of that to be able to repay us in time, all of that is suddenly out the window, right? We have no way of getting that money back. And so essentially the U.S. has invested in something that ends up crashing in and of itself. Okay, so this is kind of a almost like a delayed response. And of course, now that the fuse, if you like, if you want to think of it in this term of a metaphor, right, there's kind of like a trail of gunpowder coming back to the United States. Okay, now the gunpowder has exploded in our faces, and now the United States is no longer a reliable creditor anymore. Okay, we've ridden high for the last decade, but now we've joined everybody else at the bottom of the heap. And as I mentioned already, there is a lot of desperation during this time period. And the photograph that you see here in the background, even though it's washed out and cropped a bit, you can find this online if you'd like. The sign there says "For children for sale, inquire within." And the woman that you see here on the side, you can't see her whole picture here, she's actually hiding her face in shame. Okay, and she actually has 4 young children sitting on the stoop of her house here, and she is literally trying to sell her children in order to be able to pay off debts, whatever they happen to be. Okay, and not necessarily selling her children for illicit purposes necessarily, but selling them to someone to be factory workers or to be migrant workers or to work in some capacity, right? To have some kind of an income. And whether or not this woman and her family are able to work at all, we don't really know the story behind the photograph other than just the basic facts and the temperature of the time period. But this is it's a really striking image, okay, and it's one of many from this particular time period. From 1930 until 1933, the unemployment number in the United States jumps from 4 million all the way up to 13 million. And again, this is a really large portion of the population of the United States. At its peak, the U.S. enters into about a 25% unemployment rate. So 1 in every 4 people does not have a job at all. Okay? And the people who do have jobs are barely scraping by because most corporations and companies are paying less and less and less for people to live. Okay, so even if you do have a job, it doesn't really guarantee that you have a sustainable income in order to feed your family. And many, if not most, of households at this point have multiple people, if not everybody in the house, working a full-time job just to make ends meet. And as you can imagine, everything from sheer starvation to malnutrition and illness are all common during this time period. This is when polio becomes incredibly proficient in the United States, or a lot of people, a lot of children in this case, contract polio because of malnutrition. A lot of people start to catch things like rickets and scurvy, most things that in the United States don't exist today just because of the all the nutritional advances that we've made, right? All the scientific advances that we've made, and the fact that the government and the country as a whole, compared to this time period anyway, is more prosperous than it was, right? There are actual nutrition programs in place to prevent this type of thing from happening. And of course, the lawlessness that we see happening in Europe at this point in time starts to kind of bleed over into the United States as well, right? People are so desperate, they're in such a panic. They're willing to loot stores. There's all kinds of protests that start to occur against the government, against corporations. Plenty of worker strikes try to happen. There's angry mobs that occur. I mean, this is sheer chaos. And again, as the anger and so forth starts to die down, the desperation starts to actually set in. Okay, people turn to crime more and more. People who are homeless began panhandling, and panhandling is just literally begging for money on the streets. You're walking up to people asking for spare change. That's what it amounts to. And of course, some women, some men even get involved in prostitution. Right? Whatever you can do to make money and have a sustainable income of some kind, people will do just about anything they need to. And one interesting statistic here is that even though divorce rates in the United States drop, right, people are not willing to file for divorce, the rate of abandonment increases. Okay? And part of that is because divorce costs money. So if you are looking to divorce your spouse during this time period, you have to pay money to do it. And most of the time, at least at this in this particular scenario, if you're a spouse and you're trying to divorce your spouse, right, chances are one of you has a little bit more money than the other one does. Okay, and if you divorce your spouse, you try to go after them for whatever money you have, disenfranchise them in the process. Okay, so again, money kind of goes along with a lot of this. Unsurprisingly, even though it doesn't really get a whole lot of attention, birth rates also plummet. Okay, people are so malnutritioned or malnourished at this point that even if they are trying to have children, many of them can't even conceive because their bodies are so unhealthy. And of course, as you can imagine, many people simply don't want to bring children into the world. There's, you know, they don't have either they don't have the relationship to do it, or they just don't have the desire to, or they don't have the money to sustain it. Right? There's all kinds of factors involved. And the other startling statistic here is that during the Great Depression, more people leave the United States than arrive here. Okay? And this is a complete reversal of the entire system that we've seen over the course of the last several decades. I mean, again, in the last 2 or 3 decades of the 19th century, we had millions and millions of people coming to the United States, and all of a sudden more people are leaving. Right? It's actually really startling. Women are kind of it's interesting because they're kind of the glue that holds all this together, because most of the time they're the ones who are able to keep their jobs because they're willing to work for lower pay. Okay, and again, saying that they're willing to work for lower pay is kind of inaccurate. Obviously, I mean, this is the time period when women have just been able to vote for the first time, right, in the last decade or so. And the only reason that they're willing to work for lower pay is because most of the time the employers that they have are men who are not willing to, entertain the idea of paying them more. And if you are trying to start up some kind of a, I don't know, like an organized labor situation for women at this point, organized labor's already got a bad taint on it from the communist revolution. Okay, and also if you're a woman, you're marginalized in the United States at this point too. So women have a lot working against them. So this is not always a voluntary thing. I don't want it to seem like that. Most of the time it's involuntary, but there's a strange measure of security, I guess is the best way I can put it. And several different states, for whatever reason and for however they're able to enforce this, I'm really not sure. 26 states in the country actually prohibit married women from being employed. Okay, and in many cases, if you are a young unmarried woman, if you're a teacher, for example, and you get married while you're actually working, in some cases you can lose your job simply because you got married, and you get some kind of a tax break, or you now have income from a male in the household as well. Okay, and this is just a way for several different corporations or entities of some kind to basically cut corners. And again, there's something unlawful about it. Again, in today's terms, at this point in time, there wasn't as much of a precedent set for it. And of course, there's a whole tangent we could go on with institutionalized sexism as well. But it's something that we don't think about companies being able to do. Again, this is still before any kind of equal rights amendments have really, or civil rights amendments have really been enacted. That doesn't even happen until 1964. So we're still roughly 40 years, 30 or 40 years away from that type of thing already. And most single women at this point in time work as teachers. They work in clerical positions as secretaries, perhaps. So they work as saleswomen, as beauticians, as nurses. Again, the kind of the pigeonholed, traditional, stereotypical, etc. roles attached to single women for the last several decades. If you're an African American woman or a woman of color, right? If you're Hispanic, even if you are Asian American, whatever the case happens to be, most of the time you are pigeonholed even further into some kind of a service position, right? Working as a maid, a cook, a laundress, something along those lines. So again, not a whole lot has really changed in terms of social upward mobility at this point for women, and specifically for women of color. And the social demographics of the South also have not changed that much either. Again, we've talked about the fact that with the Great Migration that occurs during the First World War and goes all the way into the 1930s, and in some cases into the 40s and 50s, the African Americans largely populate the South more than anything else. Okay? or more than anyone else, I should say. 3 million people in the South also do not have electricity or running water. Okay, and this is still a point in time where this is just an example of how the country itself is largely divided geographically in terms of the economic wage gaps. I mean, the South lags behind the rest of the country in most cases, economically speaking, especially all the way up until probably the 1970s or 80s, honestly. And again, racial restrictions are still in full force. I mean, Jim Crow has not died yet. Okay? We have labor unions, churches, and even charitable organizations that are all racially restricted. Okay? In many cases, there are black and white church services, black and white labor unions, and in some cases, charitable organizations in the South simply will not even grant charity, food, clothing, stuff like that to African Americans. Okay, so this is it's a horrible reality, and there's really no better way of saying it. And when it comes to Mexicans as well, again, this is the first time period when Mexicans are entering the United States in larger numbers than ever before. In the 1920s, primarily as migrant workers. And once the Great Depression sets in, and once people get desperate for jobs, minorities tend to be the one who get the brunt of pushback here. And we've already seen this type of thing in the 19th century with Asian Americans, with African Americans. Now that we're getting more and more into the 20th century, Mexican Americans also begin to be targeted for this. And in 1935, more than 500,000 Mexicans are deported just because white Americans are worried that they are, quote unquote, taking our jobs. Okay? In Texas alone, we have 250,000. Okay, so half of that total number comes from Texas alone, unfortunately. Okay, so this is a really harsh reality, right? People are scraping for whatever they can, and if they find anybody standing in their way, they're willing to do whatever it takes to get them out of the way. Okay, so there is no way of excusing this kind of behavior, is what I'm getting at. But the desperation is what fuels it. Now, Herbert Hoover himself is initially in total denial that anything is wrong in the country. And again, as you see here from just the simple photograph of him in a tuxedo smoking a cigar, this is kind of the attitude and the situation that you might expect from Herbert Hoover. Again, where most of the rest of the country during the 30s, especially the ones that are the hardest hit by the Depression, you see them living in these little shanty towns, like the photograph underneath Hoover, and even the one in the background here. Okay, this is the reality that he's really not seeing. And his primary course of action at this point is to say that he wants to purge the economy by liquidating assets. And what that means is tell everybody to sell everything they have and they'll be fine. Okay, as if that is somehow a solution to everything. Okay? And what he doesn't realize is most people have nothing or have very little to sell. And he tries to make some kind of a concession to the country by holding little conferences in the White House, having some kind of a minor think tank of people come together and try to discuss solutions of some kind. But it's really only kind of half-hearted, right? Not a whole lot of effort is being put forth here. And again, as we've seen already before in economic crises in the past, anytime this happens, the government, for some reason, tends to respond in the opposite direction. And Hoover passes the Revenue Act in 1932 that ends up raising taxes and cutting budgets. Okay? The cutting budgets part could potentially benefit things, but raising taxes on a country of people who have already lost all their money, again, it's very counterintuitive, and it does more harm than good. And as a direct result, we see cities in total distress and chaos and all that kind of stuff, just like what you see here in the background. Central Park becomes one of these areas that is called a Hooverville. Okay, and Hoovervilles are kind of this pejorative term for these little shanty towns that are made of scraps of garbage and wood and foil and whatever people can find spliced together to make little shacks. Okay, and the cities themselves at this point don't have programs for homelessness or joblessness or anything like that, right? They might have programs for, you know, disaster relief if there's some kind of an actual natural disaster, like what we saw with the Galveston hurricane, right? Cities are programmed to work in a certain way, but again, this type of thing, there is no program in place yet. Okay? So the response by the government, whether it's at the federal, state, or local level, leaves a lot to be desired. And other little nicknames. Hoover gets a lot of flack for all this, obviously because of his response and because of the neglect that he seems to kind of put forth to the country. Hoover blankets are another little term from the time period. Hoover blankets are newspapers. Okay, if you see the stereotype of a homeless person sleeping with a newspaper for a blanket, that's what we're talking about here. Okay, so this is kind of where it has its origins. And the worst part in all this is Herbert Hoover claims that he does not want to cause the government to intervene in people's lives because he believes that that's socialism. And socialism, in his mind, leads to communism. So this response of the government not willing to do much is still fueled by a lot of, in some cases, irrational fears that communism is somehow going to seep over from Eastern Europe and take over the government of the United States. Okay? And people in the Soviet Union at this point in time have already been living in this type of a situation for a couple of decades now. Under Vladimir Lenin, people are still starving in much the same way that they are under the Tsar. And so this type of situation, Hoover thinks that somehow this is going to make things worse and that the United States is somehow better off than everybody else, even still. And his only real guidance to the country is to pull themselves up by their own bootstraps. Okay, be as self-reliant as possible, be thrifty, and rely on charity to do everything. The problem, though, is charity can only go so far, as we've seen time and time again. This is it's a very half-hearted effort, if there's any heart in it at all. And as you can imagine, the public is very, very unhappy with Herbert Hoover and what he's doing. Okay, and you see these little signs like here in the background, these two little children trying to raise money for their family. This sign at the bottom says, "Hard times are still hoovering over us." Okay, so people are using Herbert Hoover as kind of a punching bag in many cases here, and he becomes the butt of a lot of jokes, as you can imagine. As a result of the unpopularity, though, in the midterm elections in 1930, the Democrats end up winning control of the House of Representatives. Okay, so people are gradually beginning to move back into the Democratic sphere here. Unemployment ends up peaking in the United States at 15 million by the time we get into the early part of the 1930s. And so again, this is still I think roughly 25% again of the country. So again, the numbers here are a little bit staggered compared to what the census and everything has. Again, the country is still hovering about half of what we have in the United States today, maybe 150 million or 180 million, give or take. There are a couple of instances where the government tries, again, half-heartedly to institute some kind of a relief effort. One is called the Reconstruction Finance Corporation, okay? And all this really does is it gives loans to banks and life insurance companies and railroads. So any kind of major business or major corporation, I should say, gets some kind of a relief, but it doesn't affect the people themselves. Okay? And an Emergency Relief Act is given to states for construction projects to try to provide a few jobs here and there, but it can only go so far. Again, there's not really a whole lot of creativity being put forth by Hoover. And another startling statistic, again, and this is, for inflation and everything, this obviously goes up a little bit, but the average income on an annual basis of a farming family during the early 1930s is only $240. Okay? And in modern times, that's still not a whole hell of a lot. Okay, we're still only talking about a couple of thousand, maybe the equivalent of what you might expect from a part-time job today, maybe somewhere around between $10,000 and $15,000. Okay, it's still a lot less than what you would expect someone to make today. And of course, this is completely unprofitable, and this is why the agricultural sector at this point in time is shrinking dramatically, right? So many people are unable to sustain themselves as farmers that they have to go and do something else. And this is not a new thing either, right? We've already seen this happen from the end of the Civil War, getting more and more and more the further along we get. And in many cases, people end up protesting all of uh, the tax increases, all this kind of thing. Farmers especially do this by dumping their produce. Okay, and in some cases they dump it on the side of the highway, right, where people can actually go just run out and grab the food themselves. There's actually a scene from The Grapes of Wrath, if you ever get a chance to read or see it, where the government actually comes out and there is law enforcement actually guarding produce that's been dumped on the side of the highway and preventing people at gunpoint from actually going and getting the food, right? They're saying that it's the property of the U.S. government and that they're confiscating it. Okay, so you see this kind of desperation increasing in a dramatic way, and the responses on both sides become more and more dramatic. In 1932, we get a group of World War I veterans called the Bonus Expeditionary Force. Okay, this is just a group who's come together almost like an organized labor type of situation, and they have several unpaid cash bonuses for enlisting in the war. Okay? And this group actually ends up marching on the Capitol in Washington, D.C. to demand that they be paid for their service. And the House of Representatives, which is Democratic at this point, says, yes, we do need to do this. But the Senate, which is controlled by the Republican Party, says no. And the direct result of this is there is an armed clash in the Capitol between 700 U.S. soldiers and the veterans themselves over all this, okay, to try to determine who is going to get it. And the soldiers who are currently employed by the government end up defeating the veterans, and the veterans have to basically throw down their arms and either be arrested or go home. Okay, so this is again, desperation is leading to physical violence in many, many cases. 1932 is when things finally turn the corner a little bit. Somehow, in June of 1932, Herbert Hoover is renominated by the Republican Party. And partially because there's no other viable candidate. Okay? No one else is really stepping up to take over the situation. Many of them probably just don't want to bear the burden of responsibility that Hoover has at this point. On the Democratic side, though, we have the emergence of Franklin Delano Roosevelt. Okay? And FDR, as he's known more and more over time, is the one who actually ends up pulling us out of the Great Depression in the long term. Okay? And his entire approach to the presidency here is innovation and experimentation, right? Doing as much as you can to think outside the box when it comes to the government and to try to do new things and try to, again, make the country better than it has been. He actually starts to make press conferences twice a week to update the American people on what he's doing, what kind of policy he's putting forward. He doesn't keep people in the dark and just tell them to deal with it on their own the way Hoover has, right? He's actually making himself accessible. And Hoover does his best to try to, pish-posh FDR, says that, again, this is a situation where socialism is coming in, right? And if you rely on socialism, the country is going to go down the tubes. You're going to have another revolution. And again, pointing back to Russia and all that all over again. Okay? And to be fair, FDR's policies are socialistic in nature. Okay? Socialism becomes the order of the day under FDR in an unprecedented way. FDR is the only president that we have who is elected for 4 consecutive terms. Okay? He only serves 3 full terms. He dies in the midst of the 4th one. But this is, again, a period that we've never seen before in American politics and haven't seen since. As you can imagine, people are so fed up with Herbert Hoover that Roosevelt ends up winning the election by an overwhelming margin. 23 million votes to Hoover's 16 million. It's surprising that Hoover actually got that many. And Roosevelt himself is a different type of individual from Herbert Hoover. Again, Hoover is a self-made millionaire. Okay? He has kind of followed his own advice, pulled himself up by his own bootstraps. Roosevelt, though, actually comes from a very privileged background. Okay? His entire education is facilitated by private tutors. He goes to Harvard and Columbia. He attends law school. He's a very well-educated man, very intelligent. In 1910, he actually wins a seat in the New York State Senate. Woodrow Wilson makes him the Secretary of the Navy in 1913. He actually serves as the Secretary of the Navy, I believe, during World War I. And if you recall from the 1920 election, he was the vice president running mate of James Cox on the Democratic ticket. Even though James Cox doesn't win the election in 1920, right? It goes to Calvin Coolidge, right? FDR kind of makes a little bit of a brief appearance there already. Now, when it comes to his personal health, this becomes a talking point early on in his presidency and something that becomes associated with him more and more over time. In 1921, FDR becomes kind of a victim of the malnourishment of the time period, the malnutrition, and he ends up contracting polio. Okay? And this is before a polio vaccine really existed. Okay, that doesn't actually come about until the 1950s. In fact, if you're a member of the baby boomer generation, or if you know anybody who is, chances are they have a polio vaccine scar on one of their arms from where they were given it as a child. But FDR contracts polio in 1921, and over time, the disease progresses to where it ends up affecting his spinal cord, and he begins to slowly lose the use of his legs. Okay. Initially, he walks with a cane and kind of has to prop himself up on a podium by holding on to it. Right? He can stand for a brief period of time, but as we get in more and more into his presidency, he is actually confined to a wheelchair for the remainder of his life. And this was something that he tried to conceal for a long period of time. It was something that was considered a potential weakness in the eyes of the public to have a president who could be looked upon as an invalid. But I mean, again, in the time period, that's the way it was looked at, right? The movement of people, able to continue with some kind of a physical disability. There wasn't a whole lot of facilitation for it yet, right? There wasn't any kind of public facilities, wheelchair ramps. None of that really existed at this point in time, right? A lot of that didn't even come about really until we get into the 1980s and 90s. Okay, so again, FDR still ahead of his time for what he's able to accomplish. And as his personal character goes, a lot of people who knew him during the time claim that he was a very genuinely caring individual, right? That he actually was fond of people, that he wasn't just standoffish, he wasn't just a politician, in other words. And again, the most successful aspect of his presidency and what he's able to do is that he is able to use his office to creatively experiment with the way that government policy is used. Okay? And again, in ways that haven't really ever been done before, okay? And in ways that make a lot of people nervous, honestly, during this time. Now, at the beginning of his presidency, Roosevelt is advised by many of the people around him in the possibility of actually taking control of the country as a dictator. Okay? And this sounds like a very, very fishy thing in hindsight, but it's not without precedent everywhere else in the world. Okay? And over time, FDR is viewed on the same level as many of the other dictators of the time period. Okay, Germany, Italy, and the Soviet Union have already gone into a totalitarian system at this point. Okay, Germany has already seen the beginnings of the rise of the Nazi Party. Italy has already had Mussolini begin fascism, and the Soviet Union has already gone into a full communistic state. So FDR could potentially take a socialist dictatorial stance here and try to, disband Congress and just take control of the country on his own. To his credit, though, he decides not to. Okay? He says he wants broader executive power, but he still wants Congress there to help keep him in check and to listen to their advice. Okay? So he flirts with the line a little bit, but he doesn't go completely overboard. Okay? And again, part of this is because the capitalist system, a lot of people think at this point in time that it's very, very weak. Okay? That it just breeds greed, and greed, of course, has led us to where we are at this point in the country. And he very famously says the only thing we have to fear is fear itself. Okay, so he's very confident in his ability to lead the country in his creativity and everything. So he gives the country a brighter outlook in terms of what he wants them to do. And he's got 4 major challenges ahead of him in order to bring us out of all this. First one is to revive an industrial economy. Okay, we've relied so heavily on having one based on manufactured commodities to give to people that we've kind of lost sight of what it is that's been really giving people jobs more than anything, and that is industry. Obviously, relieving the human element in all this, right? Getting rid of the misery that human beings are having to deal with in terms of not being able to feed themselves, selling their children, foreclosing on their houses, all that kind of stuff. Get rid of a lot of that. Rescuing the farm sector is another big deal. We haven't talked about the Dust Bowl yet, but that's an ecological disaster that occurs in addition to the economic disaster at the time. And also to try to find a way to reform the capitalist system. Okay, again, capitalism is under fire at this point, and that's part of the reason why so many people want him to become a dictator, is because potentially this could be a viable alternative to what we've done so far in the country. And thankfully, compared to Hoover's administration, Roosevelt's administration is completely founded on action. Okay, he is willing to actually do things for the country rather than just sit around hem-haw and come up with 1 or 2 little potential ideas. He actually does go out and do things. For one thing, he establishes what is known as a brain trust. Okay, and this is where he has on retainer several different professionals in different fields, right? Economists, historians, geographers, people who are educated academic individuals, sociologists, people who can give him professional advice about how to proceed and what will be the best for society as a whole. So he keeps them as a group of people close to him so he can listen to what they have to say. So extremely intelligent way of doing things there. And he comes up with a 3-pronged strategy based on these different voices that are speaking to him here. First one is to address the banking crisis, okay, and provide some kind of short-term relief for those who have no jobs. Okay? Again, the banking crisis is what has gotten us here in the first place, right? This is what needs immediate attention. Second thing is to try to encourage management and unions to come to some kind of an agreement, okay? Because management is not willing to hire many unions in this case because they're so worried about the communist incursion. Okay? They're worried that unions are going to become radicalized, that they're going to take over, that there's going to be violence and all kinds of problems. And unions are being blacklisted by management as a direct result, and they're not willing to work with management in many cases. So he's trying to get both of them to the table here. And also when it comes to the farmers, he wants to pay some kind of a government subsidy to them to reduce their crop and herd sizes. And this is one of the most difficult things to fathom here, is because if you somehow reduce what you have, again, it seems counterintuitive, right? It seems like you would want to have more food in order to be able to feed yourselves. But he says here that if you reduce crop sizes, if you reduce herd sizes in livestock, in other words, you would have to literally cull livestock. You would have to go out and slaughter several cows, pigs, chickens, and so forth. He says to do this would cause commodity prices to go up. Okay? In other words, it would cause you have too much supply right now, but you need more demand. Okay? So if you reduce the supply, it increases the demand, it increases the prices on things, and so people who can afford to pay for these types of things will be able to pay you more and will actually cause farmers to get a little bit more money, might provide a little bit of relief. Okay? And from March 9th to June 16th of 1933, FDR introduces what he calls the first New Deal. Okay? And this is something that goes for the first 2 years of his presidency. It's 15 pieces of legislation that end up making up a new kind of quasi-socialistic form of the U.S. government. Okay? The federal government increases its authority, begins to enact new programs that it's never tried before, and all due to the creativity of FDR and the brain trust he has working with him. Now again, the first thing that he has to contend with is the financial system. Okay? In March of 1933, he puts forth the Emergency Banking Relief Act. And it begins with a 4-day bank holiday to cool everybody's tensions, okay? Because people are going to the bank on a regular basis. They're trying to take all the money out in cash and go hide it in a mattress, bury it in their backyard. People are panicking. And to close the banks for 4 days, FDR says this will give people a period of time to basically say, we don't need to panic. Okay? 3 days later, he has his first what are called fireside chat radio addresses. Okay, and this is something that, to his credit, he does in keeping in contact with the American people. Okay, he actually has these regular radio programs that he broadcasts all over the country to 60 million listeners in the U.S., telling them to keep calm, everything is okay. We have programs that are working right now. You don't need to panic. Okay, and he says that their money is safe in the bank. He says people are not going to touch your money, so don't go taking money out of the bank because it's making things worse. In other words, if you take more hard currency out of the banks, there's only so much currency to go around in the country at this point. Okay, Hoover has already put us into a deflation period where there is less and less currency to go around. In June, he creates the Federal Deposit Insurance Corporation, the FDIC. Okay, and FDIC, you hear this anytime there's a commercial on TV nowadays about banking or about loans or creditors or something like that. If they're a member of FDIC, that means that they are insured by the federal government. And this guarantees customer accounts in banks up to $2,500. Okay, it says that you are guaranteed that amount of money. No one is going to touch it. And it also does something brand new in that it completely separates commercial banking from investment banking. And this is another very intelligent move on Roosevelt's part and on the government's part in general, because commercial banking and investment banking up until this point have all been married together and have ended up kind of blobbing together in a certain way. If you are simply if you're investing in the stock market, right, you would go to a regular bank instead of going to a specialty bank to do this. Okay, and the temptation there is if you are one of these bank creditors or something, you might potentially be tempted to dip into somebody's commercial checking account in order to take money out in order to pay for certain things, right? So it eliminates a line of corruption that's potentially there. And it says that only investment banks can take part in stock trading after 1933. So investment banking is completely separated now from commercial banking. And so it eliminates the temptation to do anything unlawful. And the Federal Reserve Board is now given more authority to be able to intervene anytime any kind of future emergency occurs. Okay, so the Fed can actually step in and enact certain rules and laws and so forth to prevent anything like this from occurring again. The Security Exchange Act of 1933 becomes the first piece of major federal legislation that regulates the sales of stocks and bonds. Okay, this is another thing too. Says that anybody who is investing in anything has to have full corporate transparency. They have to know exactly what that corporation is going to do with their money. Okay, so in other words, they're not just going to rat hole it away or pocket it or something like that. They have to report on what they're doing. And the Exchange Act that occurs the next year in 1934 establishes a Securities and Exchange Commission. And this is basically the situation or the entity, the government entity that oversees the regulation of stocks and bonds. So this makes it a permanent entity. The Economy Act of 1933, meanwhile, ends up cutting government workers' salaries. Again, doesn't really help the government workers all that much, but it ends up slashing budgets here and there. Ends up reducing payments to veterans for non-service connected disabilities too. And this is, again, something that doesn't really bode well for everybody, right? Not everybody benefits from this. Many people don't benefit from it. But if you are a veteran and you have a disability related to, say, a factory accident, if you've come home from the war, okay, it doesn't give you any kind of payment for that. Okay, that comes from a completely different type of budget. It reorganizes a lot of federal agencies, again, tries to streamline them a little bit, cut budgets, cut costs where it can. And the 21st Amendment is passed in December of 1933, and this is repealing prohibition. Okay? And this is a really, really big move for the federal government, something that is, again, in hindsight, pretty intelligent, because having prohibition enacted by the 18th Amendment actually reduced a lot of jobs and lost a lot of government revenue because the alcohol tax in particular made up a sizable percentage of the federal budget. Okay, so, or the federal income, that is. So to reintroduce it, right, it pleases the Democratic Party. It ends up creating more jobs, right? Breweries can reopen. It again creates jobs there, and people who want to purchase alcohol to be able to, they can do that now, and the funds from that go back into the federal government. So helps a little bit in that regard. And the federal government also directly intervenes in Americans' lives under Roosevelt. Okay? Instead of doing the dole, right, which is just giving out a regular government check to people on a regular basis because they're unemployed, FDR is more eager to give them a job instead. So it's the old adage of, if you give a man a fish, he'll eat for a day. If you teach a man to fish, he'll eat every day for the rest of his life. Okay? So giving them something sustainable. And the reason that people look at the dole as an alternative here is because this is essentially what some totalitarian governments in Europe are doing. In particular, Italy does this. Okay? So again, and it's not sustainable, right? It does more to hurt the economy than it does to help. One of the first government entities that comes about during the period that goes along with the job relief thing is the Federal Emergency Relief Administration, or FERA. Okay? And FERA sends several grants to different states to try to spend them on the unemployed, on the homeless, to build soup kitchens, to do this kind of thing. And again, it's only temporary; it's not sustainable. And the ultimate response to FERA is the Civil Works Administration. And the Civil Works Administration is kind of the next stepping stone, I guess, if you like, because FERA is kind of the temporary one. Okay? November 1933, the CWA is created to have the federal government directly employ people in the United States. Okay, so all responsibility for employment in the U.S. is now placed directly on the federal government, and this is a massive load to bear, as you can imagine. Pays 40 cents an hour for unskilled workers and $1 an hour for a skilled worker. So again, like we've talked about in the past, skilled workers are people who have been trained in a specific trade. So if you are an artisan of some kind, a blacksmith, if you are a woodworker or a clockmaker, something like that, that's what it's traditionally been. It gets a little bit more technical the further along we get now because we have machinery in place and that sort of thing. And if you're an unskilled worker, that means that you are doing manual labor. Okay? And again, the amount of money that's being paid here sounds just like a pittance, but it's about as much as the government can offer at this point. And there's 4 million federal jobs created during the winter of 1933 and 1934 as a direct result of the CWA being put into effect. So this is actually pretty effective. And as a direct result, we get over 500,000 miles of railroads, there's over 1,000 airports, and 40,000 public schools that are built as a direct result of projects that are put forth by the CWA. Right? All these construction projects. And there are 50,000 teaching jobs created as well. Okay? If you are a skilled worker would be a teacher, right? Someone who is educated, who is trained to do this. Over time, the cost itself, again, proves to be unsustainable. Okay, it's $1 billion to keep this thing afloat. And by spring of 1934, unfortunately, all 4 million people who were involved in this become unemployed again. So there's several different little false starts that you see here. Okay, the government tries one thing and it fails, and then it tries another thing that fails. Okay, but the constant experimentation and the constant effort put forth provides gradual relief more and more. The Civilian Conservation Corps, though, is the most successful New Deal program, okay, because it does more in terms of provision than the others do. Okay? And what this is specifically geared toward is 500,000 unemployed single young men. Okay? 2,500 camps are constructed in the United States to house the Civilian Conservation Corps. And the typical candidate for this has to be a young man between the ages of 17 and 27, between 60 and 78 inches tall. So in other words, roughly about, 5 feet to 5 foot 8 inches, right? over 107 pounds, and have at least 6 teeth. Okay, mainly for health reasons, right? If you have fewer teeth than that, chances are you're malnourished and you won't be able to do the kind of work that needs to be done. Okay? And you're paid $1 a day for 9 months. Okay, so this is it again doesn't sound like a lot, but for young men of this particular age, this is a pretty decent gig. Okay? And most of it has to do with working in the forestry regions, right, in the national parks, right. You're building roads or trails, bridges, campgrounds, fire towers, fish hatcheries. There are 3 billion trees planted, and sometimes they act as firefighters as well. And the other thing to mention too, in the midst of all this, is the CCC also provides a high school education to these young men too. So if they don't have a GED, or if they don't have a high school diploma, they get that too in the process. So it provides work and education. And Oscar DePriest, who, as we talked about in the 1920s, is an Illinois legislator, right, first black legislator in a northern district elected since Reconstruction. He introduces an amendment that eliminates discrimination, right, based on any kind of race, color, or creed in the program. So in other words, you can be a young African American man, you can be a young Mexican American man, Asian American man, whatever the case may be. You're welcome into the program. It is still segregated, though, is the problem. Okay? And again, a lot of these government programs are, and that's one of the major failings of the New Deal programs, is it doesn't address segregation, and it doesn't always address discrimination either. The Homeowners Loan Corporation is another thing created by FDR, and this helps people refinance their mortgages so that they can make lower monthly payments and avoid bankruptcy, right? Refinancing your house. 1934, the Federal Housing Administration is created, right? FHA, right? If you ever have if you ever take out a loan for a house, chances are, especially if it's for the first time, you're doing it in FHA, an FHA loan. You're doing it it creates a program to offer Americans a longer mortgage term, right? So 20 years as opposed to the traditional, whatever it was at the time, I think it was 10 years. So you can have a reduced payment and stretch it out over a longer period of time. And the National Industrial Recovery Act, NIRA, is also created. This creates a federally funded public works system to provide construction jobs for people. Okay, so again, people building bridges and roads and so forth, similar to the Civilian Conservation Corps. And the Public Works Administration is kind of the branch of this. This is granted $3.3 billion for the construction of government buildings and highways and bridges and dams and so forth. So anything that is directly monitored by the federal government or that is funded by the government is done through the PWA. Okay, and FDR, as you can already tell, loves his abbreviations, right? You see a lot of abbreviations during his term. The National Recovery Administration, the NRA, different from the National Rifle Association, different NRA, sets different prices and wages and standards for working conditions. So this acts kind of as a larger, it's like a corporation that acts in a similar capacity to an organized labor situation. Okay, so if you're a member of a labor union, you typically look to the NRA to kind of set a lot of these new standards here. And it becomes controversial too because it's different from organized labor in that it actually ends up favoring corporations and allows them a certain measure of freedom to do what they want when it comes to industrial standards. So kind of looks the other way when it comes to antitrust laws. Okay, so kind of grants a little bit of freedom to corporations, doesn't always benefit the workers themselves, but it becomes kind of a temporary thing. And it also promotes a 40-hour work week, a minimum wage, and a ban on all underage employment. Okay, anybody who is over the age of 16 can be employed now. So we've gotten rid of child labor effectively here. And it also grants union rights. Okay, FDR has already said that he wants management and unions to work together, and so this is kind of the culmination of that. Unfortunately, though, this doesn't benefit anybody who is an agricultural or domestic worker, and unsurprisingly, this mostly ends up affecting African Americans. They still are the most marginalized group in the country at this point. And over time, it's declared unconstitutional and becomes dissolved in 1935. So again, one of those other instances where this is only a temporary solution, right? Something's just a stopgap that is not fully realized for a long period of time. In terms of the Dust Bowl itself, okay, um, if you see here in the background, this is one particular, again, another nightmare scenario for a farmer during this period in time. This is an ecological disaster that happens in the 1930s where there is a large-scale drought that occurs all throughout the Midwest and into the South, and it causes the topsoil, right, the the top of the ground, right, where you would actually have to dig down to actually plant something, completely scorches it. Okay, right, the sun has burned it to the point to where there's no moisture in it at all, and it becomes like a powdery sand. And when the winds end up kicking up, and several windstorms end up coming through at this point, it ends up kicking up all the topsoil, and it creates these gigantic dust clouds and dust storms. And the dust itself gets so heavy and so thick that it can actually bury and completely smother farmland, which is what you're seeing in the background here. So this is actually an automobile here that you see in the center of the picture, buried all the way up to the steering wheel in dirt. Okay? There's a wagon here, or part of it, that's buried all the way up to it as well. In terms of what the government tries to do here, the Farm Credit Administration is created here to try to help farmers deal with some kind of debts that they may occur or incur, and to try to help lower their mortgage payments so that they don't have to go bankrupt either. The biggest piece of assistance that goes toward farmers at this point is the Agricultural Adjustment Administration, or the AAA. Again, different from the AAA in terms of who helps you with your car when you're stuck on the side of the road. The AAA in this case ends up raising prices for crops and herds, again, by telling farmers to try to reduce production, right? So in other words, the government will pay you as a farmer to cull your livestock, to dig up your plants and so forth, and to try to create more of a demand instead of the supply. And surprisingly, this ends up working. Okay, from 1932 to 35, farm incomes end up increasing by 58%. Okay? In other words, it seems like it might be antithetical to do this, to get rid of whatever products you have, but it creates more of a demand. And there is also an additional taxation that the government puts forth on all commodity processors. So anything like a cotton gin, a flour mill, slaughterhouses, anything that ends up processing any of the raw materials or whatever is being grown or fostered or something like that on a farm ends up being taxed. And again, 1930 to 1936 is the period known as the Dust Bowl. This is what we were just discussing a second ago. Again, massive amount of drought plus the strong winds equals this gigantic blanket of topsoil that is completely destroyed. And you end up with situations called black blizzards. And there are photographs of these that are absolutely terrifying. It's a black cloud of dust that is just hurtling towards you at several dozens of miles an hour, and all you can do is duck and cover, because it's almost like if you ever see a volcano erupting, the pyroclastic flow, that gigantic cloud of ash hurtling towards you at several hundreds of miles an hour. It's kind of like that, right? You could potentially be buried in this. Okay? Pyroclastic flow will kill you, but because it's so hot. But in the Dust Bowl, you could literally be buried alive if you're not careful. And by 1938, over 25 million acres of prairie land in the Midwest is completely destroyed, right? There's no way that you can grow anything because you might have several feet of topsoil that is completely just sand and clay. And so farmers are now completely in the ditch all over again, right? They're not able to repay their debts. They're not able to raise crops anymore. And this is what causes groups from Oklahoma and Arkansas to begin to migrate west. And you get nearly 1 million of these people. They're known as Okies and Arkies. Okay? And they're one of the most famous images from the Great Depression is one of a young migrant mother from Oklahoma. She has a worried look on her face, and she has 2 or 3 children that are kind of hanging on her shoulders. She's kind of staring off into the distance. And you can see that the desperation and the worry is just wearing on her, right? She doesn't really know what to do about all this, right? And she's one of these migrant families, right? She has a completely unsure future, right? She has children to provide for. Um, at the same time, too, the government enacts the Tennessee Valley Authority, the TVA. And the TVA actually does a lot, not even just during the 30s, but all the way up into the 60s as well. Extends electrical power, flood control, and jobs into the Appalachian Mountain region. Okay, this is in kind of um, the Atlantic uh, coastal states, so places like the Carolinas, into Tennessee, into Kentucky, all the regions in the Appalachian Mountain Range where people, the quote unquote hillbillies, right, the people who are still kind of at the bottom of the social totem pole and who are the most underdeveloped in the country, this finally gives a little bit of advancement to them. By 1940, there are 21 hydroelectric dams that are constructed in the United States, particularly in this region. Okay, um, and does a lot of different things, some good and some bad. Okay, completely changes the ecology of the region for one thing, because in some cases, entire rivers are dredged. Right, when dams are created, it dries up entire valleys, can destroy wildlife populations in some cases. Um, Forestry management, some cases controlled fires are burned into regions, kill some wildlife. But again, it completely changes the way that the environment looks, for better or for worse. But it does manage to improve schools, builds libraries, uh, advances education, labor unions, and all this kind of stuff. So it industrializes the area. Again, not always for the better, but when it comes to the human element, it does end up helping for the most part. And 1.5 million farms in this area end up receiving electricity and indoor plumbing for the very first time. Okay, this is still where people are living in shacks in the mountains and using an outhouse or using whatever they can to get by. And of course, one other element in all this that sets a brand new precedent is the presence of the First Lady. Okay. Eleanor Roosevelt becomes the prime example of the way a First Lady ends up interacting and taking control of social programs in the United States. Okay. While her husband ends up running the rest of the country, she is more involved in the human element. Okay. And Eleanor Roosevelt is an icon when it comes to social justice campaigns and actually getting down and helping the people themselves. And she works primarily on behalf of women, right? This is a brand new time period. Only about 20 years have passed at this point, give or take, right? Since women have been able to vote, right? So women's rights are on the rise. And also, she promotes assistance to African Americans and to the youth of the country as well, right? Any group that is consistently marginalized in the country, she campaigns on their behalf. And she sets a lot of precedents as an individual, as a woman, right? She is the first woman to address a national political convention, right? The Democratic Convention. She writes a nationally syndicated newspaper column that's printed once a week. And she has regular press conferences that she herself holds in terms of what she is doing, what her husband is doing, what the government is doing, right? So she's taking on a role that women have never experienced or enjoyed in government before. In 1933, she even goes so far as to convene a press conference at the White House directed at FERA itself while it was still in existence to try to advance the needs of women. Okay, because women at this point, she says, are even more marginalized, right? There is no, uh, there are no programs directed toward women's health, women's needs, sanitation, all this kind of stuff, right? Stuff that, just gets overlooked all the time. And as a direct result of some of her intervention in all this, we end up with 300,000 more women who are employed within 6 months in government projects. Okay, they actually begin to turn out in droves and are encouraged to come and join the system. As it relates to her relationship with her husband, Eleanor Roosevelt said in many instances later on in life, in many autobiographies, that her intimate relationship with FDR was strained and was never quite enjoyable to her in the first place. She was more interested in actually helping people and all that rather than maintaining a romantic relationship with her husband. And a lot of that has to do with the fact that FDR himself had an affair. Okay? And to add insult to injury, it was a friend and the secretary of Eleanor's named Lucy Mercer. After that, she discovers the affair and ends up choosing to remain married to her husband. She believed that it was in the best interest of the country, of the government, of the people, having some sort of entity to rally around for people, rather than to divorce. Right? If she chose to divorce, she believed that it was going to set too much of an example for the remainder of the country and cause things to fall apart too much. And as a direct result, too, she believed that she was going to just remain terminally distant from her husband, and they never actually had a romantic relationship thereafter. So it's a kind of a tragic situation here in terms of all that. But again, for Eleanor, it works out for the best for her because she's interested in helping others more than more than herself and her own relationships. The image that you see in the background here is another one that actually is one of the most striking images and one of the most contrasting images of this particular time period. And it tells the real harsh truth about life in the United States during the Great Depression leading into the 1940s. The billboard in the background shows a white American family in a car, right, wearing their best, right, going on some kind of vacation, and it says there's no way like the American way. And yet in the foreground, in front of this billboard, you see a line of African Americans waiting for a soup kitchen to be able to feed themselves. Okay? And this is very much a telltale image in the United States, right? This is not a situation where everybody ends up enjoying the same things in the country. Even those who do have money, who do have a few things, they aren't able to afford a lot. But even still, those who are at the other end of the economic gap end up enjoying less and less. And the New Deal programs themselves typically benefit African Americans the least. Again, because they are prone to discrimination, prone to segregation, because they continually benefit industries in areas that do not include African Americans, industries in areas that actually actively discriminate against African Americans. And FDR also fails to address all sorts of racism in the South because, remember, at this point in time, the Democratic Party is still in transition, right? It is still the Democratic Party in the South is still a holdover from the Civil War, quite frankly, right? It's still the party that was involved in secession from the Union, and in many Southerners' eyes, it's still the conservative party in the country. And FDR is really one of the first presidents who's a Democratic president who leads it more into the human element, moves it away from conservatism and more into a liberal socialistic stance. So there's still a large transition here is kind of what I'm getting at. In order to be able to reach all corners of his contingency, he has to turn a blind eye to certain things, and there's no excuse for it, right? There's no way of saying that this was what he had to do, right? He could have done a lot more, obviously, but he believed in order to be able to maintain the votes of Southern Democrats that addressing racism overtly and directly was going to do more harm to his administration than anything else. So it's one of his major failings as a president. And in the midst of all this, African Americans are still migrating to the Democratic Party more and more because of what FDR is trying to do in some cases, because there are government assistance programs that are available if you are involved in industry and so forth. Right, so there are certain areas in the North, if you are an African American who has been part of the Great Migration, for example, you probably would benefit more from FDR's presidency than from Hoover's, for example. But if you are still living in the South, chances are you're still involved in agriculture, you are still suffering, and you are still not going to get a whole lot out of it. So it's a catch-22, I guess. In 1935, the court case Grovey v. Townsend ends up upholding Texas Democrats' precedent for having a whites-only election primary. So this is still a long way off, right? In Texas in particular, right? Unfortunately, where we are right now, there's no advancement here, right? There's no march forward in terms of getting rid of institutionalized racism. And again, many of these New Deal programs actively discriminate against African Americans. Okay, the AAA ends up giving subsidies to farmers and ends up forcing a lot of tenants and sharecroppers off the farms. Okay, so this thing about reducing supply in order to increase demand, the supply is usually being supplied by African American sharecroppers. So tenants have to kick them off their farms in order to be able to cause their own debts to be paid off. So this is people kind of eating each other alive, if you like. FHA in many cases refuses mortgages to blacks trying to move into white neighborhoods. Again, this is where you get things like the sign up here in the top right corner. And even the CCC and the TVA practice racial segregation actively. Okay, so if you are getting into the Civilian Conservation Corps, you're a young African American man, chances are you're going to be put into an African American camp. And also, if you're a poor African American family living in the Tennessee Valley, you probably are not going to get the same benefits as a white family. Okay? Even in the midst of all this, you might not get running water or electricity. So again, tons and tons of failing by the U.S. government still. And again, Eleanor Roosevelt is one of the only individuals involved in higher levels of government who is able to spread any kind of awareness in terms of black struggles. And Mary McLeod Bethune, who, if you recall from way, way back, right, we talked about her back in the period of Reconstruction and the beginning of Jim Crow, right? She was the first woman to begin a four-year university, a first African-American woman to begin a four-year university in the South. She is appointed as the director of the Division of Negro Affairs within the National Youth Administration. And this is a designation that is supposed to provide jobs for unemployed young African Americans in the country. So she's still actively involved, however many decades later, right? She's still fighting for civil rights in the midst of all this. And she's also responsible for creating an informal black cabinet that exists within the U.S. government to try to ensure that African Americans are getting equal access to all this. Okay? Just because, as we've already seen, a lot of these federal programs discriminate or segregate African Americans. So there's tons of margin for error here, and she's trying to help bridge those gaps and fill them in so that this doesn't continue. So it's to her credit. And civil liberties at this point in time are still a very, very, very big problem in the United States. There's no way to overstate it. In 1931, we get an instance that's extremely tragic and similar in many cases to the Emmett Till case that happens in the 1950s. 1931, we have something called the Scottsboro case. And this happens in Alabama. And it concerns 9 young African-American youths in Alabama, and you see their photograph here in the background. They're accused of raping 2 young white women. And this entire scenario is something that is so has such thin evidence. It's so flimsy. There's so many conflicting testimonies that occur here. And the fact that there is an all-white jury in the South, this raises a lot of eyebrows around the country because people are gradually beginning to realize that the South is still acting this way, that it is still enforcing Jim Crow, that it is actively discriminating against people just simply because of their race. 8 of the boys are initially sentenced to death for doing this, and again, this is it's miraculous that they escaped being lynched because that would have been the standard and was the standard in many cases in the South, all the way up into the 1950s in some cases. Both girls are eventually revealed to be prostitutes, for one thing, so it ends up kind of reducing their credibility in terms of their testimony. One even goes so far as to completely recant the rape account, saying that she lied under oath and all this kind of stuff. And it becomes such a massive court case. It doesn't get a whole lot of attention really in hindsight, but it produced more trials, more appeals, reversals, and retrials than any other U.S. court case in history up until that point. Okay, so this is something that is dramatically overturned and tossed around and re-examined several times. And eventually, the charges are dropped against the 4 youngest defendants, and parole is granted to the others over time. So they all manage to escape death miraculously again. And the last defendant isn't released until 1950. Okay, so we get 19 years that this individual has been imprisoned for something that they didn't even do. So again, we go a long way here, but this is still it's unfathomable that this type of thing is still occurring in the United States at this point, right? There are still pockets of the U.S. in the 30s, well up into the 40s and 50s, again, especially in the South, where this type of thing is allowed to occur. And another thing that doesn't get a whole lot of attention all the way up into the 20th century is the Bureau of Indian Affairs. Okay, Native Americans have kind of been shoved into a corner and largely forgotten in many cases. John Collier becomes the head of the Bureau of Indian Affairs at this point in time, and he does his best to ensure that Native Americans are also granted access to these relief programs. Okay? He increases a lot of employment of Native Americans at the BIA, tries to put them in more situations of authority than they've had before, and he also attempts to move what he calls the Indian Reorganization Act through Congress. Okay? And this is a very optimistic program that he's got in mind. Okay? It would have done a lot for Native Americans in the country, would have potentially advanced them socially in many ways, would have reinvigorated their traditions, would have restored their lands to them, granted business rights, given them self-governing constitutions for Indian nations, given them federal funding. But unfortunately, it gets shaved down, watered down, and becomes something known as the Indian New Deal. And it doesn't do much except provide just partial relief. It gives them a little bit of money. And I think the only real long-lasting effect that it has is that it leads tribes to start revising constitutions to allow women to vote and hold office. Okay, so large missed opportunity here. Would have done tons and tons for Native Americans. It just didn't happen. Unsurprisingly, the New Deal is not popular with everybody. Okay, a lot of people still believe that it is a form of socialism, that it's going to do more to destroy the capitalist system that we've had in the country, and get individuals like Huey Long here. Huey Long is a very colorful character from the 1930s. He's nicknamed the Kingfish, and he's a senator from Louisiana who basically runs Louisiana like his own personal little kingdom. Okay, he's prone to corruption. He's prone to stabbing his opponents in the back, to getting people to lose their jobs and so forth. Uses bribery all the time, intimidates people, blackmails people to get his way, to get legislation passed, and so forth. And though he is a Democrat, he is one of these leftover conservative Democrats living in the South. And initially, he likes what Roosevelt is doing until he looks at the NRA and says that the NRA and big business is not really it's not being put into check anymore. Okay, and to his credit, he's right. It should be put into a certain amount of check. But what Huey Long wants to do is he wants to tax the rich and redistribute the wealth. Okay, and this is a holdover from what we saw even in Reconstruction, what the radical Republicans wanted to do. Okay, so a complete reversal of ideas here. But Huey Long makes so many enemies that he is actually assassinated in September of 1935. He, at one point, plans to run against Roosevelt in the next election, and before he can really campaign, he is actually shot and killed in the Louisiana state capitol immediately after he removes an opponent judge from office. So, makes a lot of enemies and runs kind of this organized crime type situation in Louisiana. So, kind of an unsurprising fate, unfortunately. Francis Townsend is another individual from the time he's a retired doctor from California, promotes something that he calls the Townsend Recovery Plan. And what this does is this is kind of a primitive version of what ends up becoming the Social Security Act. He believes that he can grant $200 a month to every retired citizen over the age of 60 and give them kind of a government pension of sorts. And it kind of amounts, again, to what we see with Social Security, right? If you are over the age of 65, right, you're able to collect a certain amount of money each year, depending on how long you've worked, and several other factors and so forth. But Again, kind of ahead of its time here, right? He is kind of standing a little bit on the shoulders of what Teddy Roosevelt wanted to do at one point, even as far back as I think 1912 or 1913. So this is still, it's marching forward a little bit here. Unfortunately, his idea would only have served about 9% of the population, and so it doesn't really hold a whole lot of water. It doesn't go very long. And one other individual who's extremely controversial and is one that several students of mine have actually written about in the past is a guy named Father Charles Coughlin. And Charles Coughlin is a radio priest from Detroit. This is when the radio starts to actually broadcast church services and so forth. And Charles Coughlin actually has his own, almost like a little talk radio show thing here, where he actually comes in and begins to criticize Teddy Roosevelt, or criticizes FDR, I beg your pardon. Criticizes FDR and the New Deal programs as socialistic, as anti-God, and says that the whole New Deal is basically a communist conspiracy. He's really trying to push this idea forward a lot more. And at this point in time, it's worth noting that the Vatican had already actually signed what was called the Lateran Pact with Mussolini in Italy, basically giving the fascist party in Italy control over the country in exchange for the Catholic Church's advocacy of it. So this is and fascism and communism are directly opposed to one another on the political spectrum. So unsurprising here, I guess, in a certain regard. And as the further we get into the 1930s, Charles Coughlin actually begins to turn his rants against Jews and actually becomes very, very anti-Semitic, becomes a proponent for Adolf Hitler. So a lot of really strange goings on with Charles Coughlin, but he's an interesting individual because of the time period that he sits in and kind of the contrast that he provides to what the country itself is doing and what people's mindsets are like during the period. By the 1930s, though, a lot of businesses are filing a lot of lawsuits against the government because of the New Deal policies are not really affecting them in any positive way. A lot of people are saying that this is harming them more than doing them any good. And to a certain extent, it does, because it's actually designed to help individuals rather than businesses. Okay, so, has some benefits and has some disadvantages, I guess. The Works Progress Administration is another big entity that's created during FDR's second 100 days in office. Okay, and it's created to basically manage new federal job programs. Okay, so again, puts the responsibility of employment on the federal government, and a lot of major fixtures in America are actually built by the WPA. So LaGuardia Airport, the St. Louis riverfront, and all the revitalization of Key West and Florida and everything. All of those are WPA projects. Okay, so a lot of widespread construction projects under those. And some cultural programs are also created out of the WPA. Okay, we get the Federal Theater Project, the Art Project, music, writers projects. So it's actually beginning to foster the arts as well. And the National Youth Administration is also giving part-time employment to certain students. Richard Nixon was actually one of the students at this point in time who got a little bit of employment from the WPA and then NYA. And ultimately, it ends up helping about 9 million people from 1935 until 1943 when it's disbanded. But the crown jewel of the New Deal program that we've been building up to here is the Social Security Act. And this is something that, amazingly enough, and doesn't get a whole lot of attention, was designed largely by a woman. The Secretary of Labor at the time was Frances Perkins. She was the first female cabinet member in U.S. history. So if you collect Social Security or you know someone who does, you have her to thank. It provides a federal retirement fund for any citizen over the age of 65 through payroll taxes. Okay? And it's a set rate for everybody. So no matter what age you are, you're putting money into Social Security based on your paycheck every month. And when you're over the age of 65, you can start collecting it. And it's a shared federal and state unemployment insurance program. Okay, and it's financed by that payroll tax on all employers. Okay, so if you're unemployable, then you are the responsibility of the state. In other words, if you're disabled, if you're too old to work, whatever the case may be, too sick, then you are the responsibility of the state. But if you are employable, then you're responsible. Then the federal government is responsible for you. And there are 3 state-administered public assistance programs that are granted federal funding. There's old age assistance, aid to dependent children, and aid for the blind. And the aid for the blind is ultimately expanded over time to include other disabilities as well. But again, Social Security doesn't benefit everybody. Okay, if you are a farm laborer, a domestic worker, or self-employed, then you, chances are, not going to get much out of this. And unfortunately, that tends to include African Americans more than anybody. And the Revenue Act of 1935, what is called the Wealth Tax Act, is another thing that's enacted. And this is something that ends up raising taxes on anyone who has an income over $50,000. Okay, and again, $50,000 at this time would have been a lot of money, right? It would have been the equivalent of maybe about $100,000, give or take. Okay, so if you were upper middle class or upper class, you were getting a lot more taxed than you would otherwise. And Roosevelt's second term in 1936, he is renominated by the Democratic Party. Okay, so this would have been his second term in office here. Alfred Landon, who is the governor of Kansas, is nominated by the Republican Party. And FDR's program has been so successful, has been so well supported by most Americans at this point that he ends up winning by a landslide. So Alfred Landon kind of just disappears and goes into obscurity a little bit. Democrats also end up taking over Congress as well. Okay, they dominate the Senate by 77 to 19 seats, and in the House they gain 328 seats to 107. Okay, so with the full backing of his political party and 2 branches of the government, FDR is able to push forward and get the country out of the Great Depression. And in this particular election, the majority of African Americans vote for a Democratic president for the first time. Okay, again, up until this point, if you recall, individuals like Frederick Douglass said that the Republican Party is the vote and all else is the sea. Okay, but because we were starting to see a complete reversal and a depolarization of political parties in America in terms of what their mission is, what their platforms are, and so forth, we're starting to see a complete change in the makeup of these different parties and who their contingencies are. The Supreme Court, though, is still populated by conservatives. So anytime that we have some kind of a civil rights case at this point in time, that's why it doesn't get a whole lot of attention. Okay, the conservative contingency of the country at this time is still very eager to silence any kind of anti-lynching laws. In fact, we didn't even get an anti-lynching law in the United States, calling it a federal hate crime, until just a few weeks ago, okay, here in the year 2020. Okay, so it's incredible how long it's taken us to get these kinds of things done, but that's part of the reason why not a whole lot gets done at this point in time when it comes to civil rights movements. February of 1937, Roosevelt does something that becomes kind of the biggest stain on his career as president, and that he does something that has been nicknamed the court packing scheme. He asks Congress to name up to 6 new Supreme Court justices, 1 for each member over the age of 70. Okay? And in doing so, what he's trying to do here is he's trying to get Congress to introduce more Democratic liberal judges into the Supreme Court to cause the Supreme Court to come onto his side. Okay? So again, it sounds like it would certainly benefit Roosevelt, it would benefit the Democratic Party and so forth, but it seems like an underhanded thing to do. It seems like he's basically just trying to drown out the conservative voices in the Supreme Court. And so Senator Hugo Black of Alabama ends up being appointed by Roosevelt after the conservative judge ends up retiring. So again, it seems like a kind of an underhanded thing for Roosevelt to do, to try to basically promote his own party in the Supreme Court. And again, there's really not really not any kind of excuse that can be given for why he's doing this, right? There's a benefit to him, there's a benefit to his mission. Whether it would benefit America as a whole, who knows? This is Willis Van Devanter. This is the guy who ends up retiring. Ultimately, Roosevelt's plan is voted down by Congress. They realize what he's trying to do, and they say, this is going to give us too much of a bad name. We don't need to do this. Okay. So it's really the biggest stain on his career, and it's the one thing that ends up getting him kind of putting him in check, I guess is the best way to put it. But here at the end of all this, as we get into Roosevelt's second term in office, this is when the nations of Europe are beginning to ramp up for World War II. Okay. In 1935 is when Adolf Hitler rises to power in Germany. Mussolini has already risen to power in Italy. Russia has already gone into a communist state long in the past. And so we're starting to see America beginning to turn its attention now away from domestic politics into international politics again. And World War II is really what effectively brings the Great Depression to an end, because of the government taking control of the means of production again, for industrializing, automobile factories, turning them into tank factories and plane factories and ammunition factories again. We get a repeat a lot of what we see from the First World War. Okay. So we'll talk more about that in the next chapter, and I guess that's all for today. Thanks for listening.